He thought forcing her onto that stage would be the highlight of the night. But in less than 5 minutes, it would become the moment everyone wished they could take back. The grand ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers, light reflecting off crystal glasses and polished marble, as laughter and low conversation filled the air. A live band played softly in the background, while cameras streamed the charity gala to thousands watching online. This was a room built for prestige, for perfection, for people who belonged, and Clara Whitman did not belong. At least that's what they all thought. She moved quietly along the edges of the room, her simple navy dress unremarkable, her hair pulled back neatly, as she carried a tray of empty glasses toward the service door. No one noticed her, no one ever did. She had been working backstage for 3 months, just another extra pair of hands in a place where appearances mattered more than names, until the host called out across the room, his voice amplified through the speakers, sharp, playful, and just loud enough to turn heads. "Hey you," he said, pointing straight at her. The music dipped slightly. As conversations paused, Clara froze mid-step, the tray trembling just enough to catch the light. A few guests followed his gaze. Then came the smirks, the subtle nudges, the quiet laughter spreading like ripples in water. The host grinned wider, stepping closer, as if he had just discovered the night's entertainment. "What's your name?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he didn't really care. "Clara Whitman," she answered softly, barely audible over the shifting crowd. "Well, Clara Whitman," he continued, dragging out her name like it was part of a joke. "How about you give us a little show tonight?" The audience chuckled. Someone whispered, "This should be good." Another voice added, "Bet she won't last 10 seconds. Clara's grip tightened around the tray. She glanced toward the exit, calculating distance, measuring escape. But the spotlight had already found her, a harsh white beam cutting through the room, pinning her in place. There was nowhere to disappear. Now the host leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to sound almost kind, but not enough to hide the edge. "Come on, Clara, don't be shy. It's for charity after all." The band members exchanged glances, unsure but ready. The pianist hovered his fingers above the keys, waiting for a cue. The room held its breath, not in anticipation, but in expectation of embarrassment. Clara stepped forward slowly, placing the tray on a nearby table. The clink of glass echoed louder than it should have. In the sudden hush, her eyes lifted, meeting the stage for the first time. The polished wood, the towering speakers, the microphone standing alone at center, like a test she never asked to take. A woman near the front row crossed her arms, whispering, "This is going to be painful." Another guest raised his phone, ready to record, already anticipating something worth sharing. For all the wrong reasons, the host gestured grandly, inviting her up, as if granting an honor rather than setting a trap. Clara walked the 20 feet to the stage, each step measured, each sound amplified by silence. Her shoes tapped lightly against the marble, then shifted to the hollow echo of wood as she climbed the steps. The light followed her every move, magnifying every doubt in the room. She reached the microphone, and for a moment, she didn't touch it. She just stood there, breathing steady, eyes calm, not searching for approval, not asking for permission. Something subtle shifted, not in the crowd, not yet, but in her. The pianist finally pressed a soft chord, testing the air. The note lingered, waiting for direction. The host stepped back, arms crossed, confident, certain he had orchestrated the perfect spectacle, but he hadn't noticed the way Clara's posture changed, the way her shoulders settled, the way her gaze steadied, like someone who had been here before. Not in this room, not with these people, but on a stage under a light with everything at stake. And as the music hovered in that fragile space between sound and silence, Clara Whitman slowly reached for the microphone, her fingers wrapped around the microphone, and for a brief second the entire room seemed to lean forward, not out of belief, but out of curiosity, the kind that comes before a mistake is made. The pianist glanced up at her, waiting for a signal, but Clara did not look at him. She did not look at the host or the crowd or the dozens of phones pointed in her direction. She simply closed her eyes and took one slow breath, the kind that carried years of something unspoken, something practiced, something buried beneath months of silence. The host shifted his weight slightly, already preparing a comment for when this went wrong, a light joke, a quick recovery, the kind that would keep the room entertained at her expense. Someone near the back whispered, "Is she even going to start?" Another voice replied, "Maybe she forgot the words." A few quiet laughs slipped through the tension, but they faded quickly because Clara did not move like someone who had forgotten anything. She stood perfectly still, grounded, as if the noise around her had already disappeared. Then, without warning, she nodded almost imperceptibly, and the pianist struck the opening chord, soft and uncertain at first, testing her range, testing her confidence. But Clara did not hesitate. Her voice entered the room so gently that for a split second people thought it was part of the music, not coming from her at all. It was clear, controlled, and impossibly steady, the kind of tone that did not fight for attention, but commanded it. The pianist's fingers paused for just a fraction of a second, caught off guard, before continuing more carefully, now adjusting to her pace, adjusting to her control. The conversations that had lingered at the edges of the room died completely. No one spoke, no one moved. The host's smile froze halfway between amusement and confusion as he watched her. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Clara was not reacting to the room anymore. The room was reacting to her. Each note she delivered carried weight, not volume, but precision. Her voice rose effortlessly, gliding through the melody with a confidence that did not belong to someone who had been pushed onto a stage minutes earlier. The woman in the front row, who had crossed her arms, slowly lowered them, her expression changing from expectation to disbelief. A man who had been recording lowered his phone slightly, as if he needed to see this with his own eyes rather than through a screen. The band members exchanged quick glances, now fully engaged, following her lead instead of waiting for her to fail. The pianist leaned into the keys, adding depth, now trusting what he was hearing. Clara opened her eyes halfway through the verse, not to search for approval, but to anchor herself. And when she did, there was no fear in them, only focus, only presence, as if this stage was not foreign to her at all, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The lighting above seemed warmer now, or maybe it was the way the room had changed. The tension that once filled the air had transformed into something heavier, something electric. A silence that demanded respect. The host took a small step back without realizing it, his earlier confidence dissolving into uncertainty, because this was no longer a moment he controlled. This was something else entirely, something unfolding beyond his script. The final line of the verse approached, and instead of building toward it with force, Clara softened her voice, drawing the entire room closer. Every ear, every breath pulled into that single, fragile thread of sound, and when she released the last note, it did not end abruptly. It lingered, suspended in the air, like it refused to be forgotten. And in that exact second, before anyone could react, before applause could begin, before a single word could be spoken, the entire ballroom fell into a silence so complete it felt almost unreal. No one moved, not even the waitstaff, frozen at the edges of the room, as if any motion might shatter what had just happened. The final note still seemed to linger in the air long after Clara's voice had faded, and for a heartbeat too long, the silence held thick and absolute. Then somewhere near the center of the ballroom, a single breath broke, followed by another, and then the faint sound of a glass being set down, far more carefully than before, as if even the smallest noise required permission. The woman in the front row blinked twice, her lips parting slightly, as she turned to the man beside her. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, but he did not answer because his eyes were still locked on the stage, trying to reconcile what he had expected with what he had just witnessed. The man who had been recording slowly lowered his phone completely, now no longer interested in capturing a moment of embarrassment, but realizing too late he had nearly missed something extraordinary. The pianist sat motionless, his hands hovering just above the keys, as if unsure whether to continue or to acknowledge that the music had already said everything it needed to say. The host finally shifted his posture, a forced smile attempting to return to his face, but it faltered halfway, his mouth opening as if to speak, then closing again, because there was nothing he could say that would match what had just filled the room. He had planned for laughter, he had prepared for awkwardness, he had expected control, but control had slipped from him the moment Clara began to sing, and now it hung somewhere out of reach, replaced by something far more powerful, something he did not understand. Clara stood still at the microphone, her hands relaxed, her shoulders steady, not searching for applause, not even acknowledging the crowd. She simply existed in that space, as if the silence itself was enough, and that unsettled them more than anything, because it meant she had not performed for them, she had not needed them. The first clap came from the back, hesitant, uncertain, like a question more than a reaction. Then another joined closer this time, and another, until the sound began to build slowly at first, then with gathering force. As realization spread across the room, people straightened in their seats, turning toward one another, exchanging glances that said the same thing: "We misjudged her." The applause grew louder, fuller, no longer polite, but genuine, the kind that rose without instruction, without obligation, driven by something deeper than expectation. The woman in the front row was now clapping, As well, her earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to admiration. The man beside her shook his head softly in disbelief, his eyes never leaving the stage. The band members began to smile subtly, their earlier uncertainty replaced with quiet respect. Even the pianist finally lowered his hands, resting them in his lap as he watched Clara with a new understanding. But through it all, Clara did not bow, she did not step back, she did not react the way they expected. Instead, she lifted her gaze, slightly scanning the room, not with pride, not with triumph, but with calm recognition, as if she had seen this before, as if she knew exactly how this moment would unfold. And somewhere in that look was a quiet truth that made the applause feel different, heavier, more meaningful, because it was not something she had chased, it was something that had arrived too late. And as the sound filled the ballroom, rising higher, echoing against the marble and glass, the host took another step back, this time fully aware that whatever he had set in motion had turned into something he could no longer control. And in that realization, something even more unsettling began to form in the back of his mind, a question he could not ignore: who exactly had he just put on that stage? The applause did not fade, it grew stronger, fuller, echoing through the ballroom, as if the room itself had decided to correct its own mistake. People rose slowly from their seats, not out of obligation, but because remaining seated no longer felt right. One by one, chairs shifted across the marble floor, the soft scrape blending into the rising sound until nearly the entire audience was standing, their eyes fixed on Clara Whitman. The same woman they had dismissed minutes earlier now held the center of a room built for people who believed they already knew greatness. When they saw it, the host felt the shift more than anyone. His chest tightened slightly as he scanned the crowd, searching for the easy laughter that had been there before, but it was gone, replaced by something heavier, something that did not include him. He adjusted his jacket out of habit, though it did nothing to restore the control he had lost. His voice, when it finally came out, sounded thinner than before as he stepped cautiously toward the microphone, trying to reclaim the moment. Well, that was, he began, but the words stalled because there was no line prepared for this, no script for being proven wrong in front of hundreds of people and thousands more watching online. Clara turned her head slightly toward him, not sharply, not confrontationally, just enough to acknowledge his presence, and in that small movement, there was a quiet authority that stopped him mid-sentence. She did not speak, she did not need to, the room was already listening to her. The applause continued, then softened naturally as if guided by an invisible cue until it settled into a respectful hush again. All eyes remained on her, waiting, not demanding, but hoping for something more. The pianist leaned forward gently, placing his fingers back on the keys this time. Without hesitation, without doubt, he played a soft progression, inviting, not leading. Clara took a single step closer to the microphone, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, as if this entire moment had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. She lifted her chin slightly, and when she began again, her voice carried deeper, this time richer, layered with something the audience could feel, even if they could not name it. There was history in it, experience in it, something that spoke of stages far larger than this room, and crowds far less forgiving. Each note unfolded with precision, yet it never felt calculated, it felt lived, as if every word she sang had been carried with her long before this night. The guests, who had once whispered, now leaned forward, completely drawn in. A woman near the back pressed her hand lightly to her chest, her eyes glistening, as if the performance had reached somewhere personal. The man who had lowered his phone earlier now held it again, but not to capture something embarrassing. Instead, his grip was careful, deliberate, aware that he was witnessing something rare, something that deserved to be remembered. The band followed Clara seamlessly, now no longer guiding but supporting her rhythm, adjusting their dynamics to match her control. The host stepped further back into the shadows of the stage, instinctively removing himself from the center, because he understood now, without needing to be told, that this was no longer his moment, and perhaps it never had been. Clara's voice rose again, not louder, but higher, stretching into a range that seemed to suspend time itself, and as it did, the room responded in kind, breath by breath silence, deep and not empty, but full, charged with attention, with respect, with something close to awe. And in that suspended moment, it became clear to everyone watching that this was not luck, this was not a surprise talent discovered by chance, this was something earned, something refined over years, unseen, years unacknowledged. And as the final phrase approached, Clara softened once more, drawing the room inward like a tide returning to shore. And when she released the last note, it did not demand applause, it did not chase reaction, it simply existed complete, undeniable. And in that quiet aftermath, before anyone could respond, before the world rushed back, in a single realization settled across the entire room all at once, they had not just witnessed a performance, they had witnessed a truth they had almost overlooked for a moment. No one dared to break what had settled over the room. The silence that followed her final note was not empty. It was full of realization, heavy with the weight of every assumption that had just been proven wrong. Then the applause came again, but this time it was different. It was not rising from surprise. It was rising from recognition. People were no longer reacting to a moment. They were responding to something undeniable, something they now understood. They had almost missed the sound, built faster this time, stronger, more unified, as if the entire ballroom had come to the same conclusion at once. Clara Whitman was not an accident. She was not a joke. She was not a last-minute entertainment. She was something far beyond what any of them had expected, and that truth echoed in every clap, every nod, every expression of quiet disbelief. The host remained at the edge of the stage, his earlier confidence replaced with something far more uncomfortable awareness. He watched the crowd stand again, watched as people who moments ago had smirked now leaned forward with respect, and he understood in a way that stung deeper than embarrassment that the moment no longer belonged to him. It never truly had. He had only revealed what was already there. Clara stepped back slightly from the microphone, not retreating, but allowing the moment to settle. Her gaze moved across the room, not searching for approval, not claiming victory, but acknowledging something unspoken. The shift had happened, and it was irreversible. The woman in the front row, who had once folded her arms, now shook her head slowly, as if trying to process what she had witnessed. "I cannot believe we almost missed that," she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the applause. The man beside her nodded without looking away. "We did not miss it," he replied quietly. "We almost ignored it." Across the room, a younger woman wiped at the corner of her eye, surprised by her own reaction. She had come expecting an evening of polished performances, something predictable, something safe. But what she had just heard felt different. It lingered in a way she could not explain. Something about it stayed with her long after the sound had faded. The pianist rose from his bench, almost instinctively stepping closer to Clara with a respect that needed no words. He gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not performative, but genuine, the kind shared between those who recognized something real. The band members followed suit, their earlier uncertainty now replaced with quiet admiration. Even the staff at the edges of the room, who had watched from the sidelines, stood a little straighter. Their expressions changed because they understood something too. Perhaps more than anyone else in the room, they knew what it meant to be unseen, and yet capable of something more. The host finally stepped forward again, but this time his movements were careful, measured, as if he was approaching something fragile. His voice, when he spoke, carried a different tone, stripped of the earlier playfulness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pausing, as if searching for the right words, though none seemed enough. "Sometimes the most extraordinary moments come from the people we overlook." He stopped there, because anything more would feel unnecessary, anything more would risk diminishing what had already been made clear. Clara did not respond to his words. She did not need validation from someone who had not recognized her value before. Instead, she turned slightly away from the microphone, her posture relaxed, but composed, as if she had simply completed what she came to do, and nothing more. The applause continued, filling the space, rising toward the high ceilings, echoing through the chandeliers, reflecting off the marble until it felt almost endless. And yet within that overwhelming sound there was a quiet understanding forming, something deeper than admiration, something closer to accountability, because each person in that room knew what they had assumed, knew how quickly they had judged and how wrong they had been. And as Clara Whitman stepped away from the center of the stage, leaving the spotlight behind as effortlessly as she had entered it, one question remained lingering in the minds of everyone watching. If someone like her could be overlooked so easily, how many others had they already dismissed without ever truly seeing them? Clara stepped down from the stage without hesitation, as if the spotlight had never belonged to her in the first place. And yet every eye in the room followed her movement with a focus that had not existed before. The applause still echoed behind her, but it no longer guided the moment. It simply confirmed what had already been decided. She walked past the front rows where guests instinctively shifted to make space, not out of obligation, but out of respect. The same people who had barely noticed her earlier now watched her as If trying to understand how they had missed something so obvious, the woman in the front row who had once crossed her arms leaned slightly forward as Clara passed, her lips parting, as if she wanted to say something, perhaps an apology, perhaps a compliment. But no words came because none felt sufficient. Clara did not slow her pace. She did not acknowledge the attention beyond a brief nod that carried more grace than any speech could have conveyed. At the edge of the stage, the host stood still. Uncertain for the first time that evening, his mind searching for something to regain control, a closing remark, a transition, anything that would shift the focus back to the program. But every option felt smaller, now diminished by comparison to what had just unfolded. He cleared his throat softly, stepping toward the microphone once more, but before he could speak, a voice rose from the audience, not loud, not disruptive, but clear enough to carry through the lingering silence. Who is she? The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and impossible to ignore. Several heads turned, others leaned in, waiting for an answer that no one seemed to have. The host hesitated, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. He glanced toward Clara as if hoping she might respond, but she had already reached the side of the room where the staff gathered, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, as if grounding herself back into the role they had assigned to her. Before any of this began, one of the event organizers approached her quickly, a man in his 40s with a polished suit and an expression that struggled to balance professionalism with astonishment. Miss Whitman, he said, his voice lower, now more careful. That was extraordinary. Truly, we had no idea. Clara met his gaze calmly, her expression unchanged. Thank you, she replied simply, her voice soft but steady, not dismissive, not eager. Just present. The organizer nodded quickly, as if realizing that praise alone was not enough to bridge the gap between what had just happened and how she had been treated earlier. We would be honored, he continued, if you would consider performing again later this evening, perhaps as part of the main program. Clara paused for a brief moment, not out of uncertainty, but consideration. Her eyes moved subtly across the room, taking in the stage, the audience, the same setting that had tried to define her. Before she spoke again, I am already part of the program, she said quietly. The organizer blinked, confused for a second, until the meaning settled in. Not as a scheduled performer, not as a featured guest, but as someone whose presence had already changed the entire event. Without permission, without introduction, he nodded again, slower this time, understanding more than he could articulate. Across the room, the question still lingered, who is she? And though no formal answer came, it began to take shape in the reactions around her, in the way people spoke more carefully now, in the way they looked at others with a hesitation that had not existed before. The host finally found his voice, returning to the microphone with a tone that carried less authority and more humility. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, pausing as if weighing each word. Sometimes we are reminded that talent does not announce itself, it does not ask for recognition, it simply waits until it is seen, and tonight we were given that reminder. He stepped back again, not attempting to reclaim the spotlight, but acknowledging that it no longer belonged to him, as Clara Whitman stood quietly among the staff, no longer invisible, yet not seeking attention. The room continued to shift around her, conversations changed, tones, assumptions dissolved, and somewhere within that transformation, a quiet realization settled, deeper than applause, deeper than admiration, that the true measure of a person had never been where they stood in the room, but how easily others chose not to see them. The room did not return to what it had been before, and that was the part no one could ignore. Conversations resumed, but they carried a different tone, softer, more careful, as if every word now had to pass through a filter of awareness that had not existed an hour earlier. Small groups formed near the stage, voices low but urgent, people replaying the moment in their minds, trying to make sense of how something so undeniable could have been hidden in plain sight. A man near the bar shook his head slowly. I have attended events like this for 20 years, he said to the woman beside him, and I have never seen anything like that. She nodded, her gaze still drifting toward Clara across the room. It is not just what she did, she replied, it is how easily we dismissed her before. That is what stays with you. Across the ballroom, the energy continued to shift, no longer centered on status or reputation, but on something quieter, something more human. The same guests who had once measured each other by titles and appearances now found themselves glancing at the staff, at the servers, at the people they had barely acknowledged earlier. And for the first time, there was hesitation in those glances, a pause where judgment used to be. Clara remained near the side of the room, her presence calm, grounded, as if the attention surrounding her did not alter who she was. One of the younger staff members approached her slowly, a woman no older than 25, her expression a mix of admiration, and uncertainty. I just wanted to say that was incredible, she said, her voice sincere but careful. Clara turned toward her, offering a small, warm smile. Thank you, she replied simply. The young woman hesitated for a moment, then added, I have never seen anyone do that before. Clara's smile softened slightly, as if the words carried a deeper meaning than the speaker intended. There is a lot people do not see, she said quietly, not as a lesson, not as a correction, but as a truth. The young woman nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it before stepping back, the exchange brief, yet meaningful in a way that lingered long after the words ended. Near the stage, the host stood alone for a moment, watching the room adjust to a reality he had not anticipated. He replayed his own actions in his mind, the casual tone, the easy assumption, the way he had turned a person into a moment without considering who she might be. His shoulders lowered slightly as the realization settled deeper. It was not just that he had been wrong, it was that he had not thought to question himself at all. He looked toward Clara again, this time not as a performer, not as part of the show, but as someone he had failed to recognize, and in that moment the weight of that failure felt heavier than any public embarrassment. The event organizer returned to his side, his voice low. We should adjust the program, he said quietly, perhaps invite her back on stage formally, give her the recognition she deserves. The host considered this for a second, then shook his head gently, not out of dismissal, but understanding. Recognition is already happening, he replied, gesturing subtly toward the room, and he was right, because everywhere he looked the focus remained on her, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. Without trying, across the ballroom a quiet path had formed, not physically, but socially, as people allowed space around her, not to isolate her, but to acknowledge her without intrusion, a kind of respect that could not be forced, only given. And as the night continued, that unspoken shift remained, guiding conversations, shaping interactions, reminding everyone present that something fundamental had changed, not just in how they saw Clara Whitman, but in how they now saw each other. And in that change there was a quiet question that lingered beneath every polite exchange. How many times had they overlooked something extraordinary simply because it did not arrive in the way they expected? The night continued, but it no longer followed the script that had been planned weeks in advance. The carefully arranged schedule, the polished introductions, the predictable flow of performances, all of it felt secondary, now overshadowed by something far more real. Small conversations turned into quiet reflections as guests began to speak, not about what they had expected to see, but about what they had nearly failed to recognize. A man near the center of the room adjusted his tie absent-mindedly, his voice low as he spoke to a colleague. I almost laughed when they called her up, he admitted, his words carrying a weight he could not ignore. The colleague nodded slowly. You were not the only one, he replied. The difference is she gave us a chance to see differently. And that realization lingered heavier than any embarrassment. Across the room, a group of younger attendees gathered near one of the tall windows overlooking the city lights, their earlier excitement now replaced with something more thoughtful. One of them spoke quietly. It makes you wonder how many people we pass by every day without ever really seeing them. The others did not answer immediately, but their silence said enough, because the question did not need a response, it needed reflection. Clara remained where she had been, near the edge of the room, her presence steady, unchanged, as if the attention surrounding her had not altered her sense of self. A few guests approached her now, not in a rush, not with entitlement, but with a kind of careful respect. Their words simple, their tone sincere. That was beautiful. Thank you for that. I have never heard anything like it. Clara listened to each of them with quiet grace, offering small acknowledgments, but never allowing the moment to turn into something about praise. She did not expand on her past. She did not explain her skill. She allowed the experience to speak for itself, and that restraint made the impact even stronger because it forced others to sit with their assumptions without distraction. Near the stage, the host stood once more at the microphone, but this time he did not attempt to entertain. He did not reach for humor or control. Instead, he spoke plainly. Tonight was meant to celebrate excellence, he said, his voice steady but quieter than before. And sometimes excellence appears in ways we do not expect. He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. Perhaps the most important thing we can take from this evening is not what we saw on stage, but what we almost failed to see at all. The room grew still again, not with tension, but with understanding, because his words reflected what everyone was already thinking. The organizer stepped forward shortly after adjusting the program in real time, announcing that the remainder of the evening would continue with a renewed focus on the purpose of the event, But even as the next segment began, it was clear that the energy had shifted permanently. The performances that followed were received with genuine attention, not comparison, not judgment, but appreciation. Each artist given the space to be seen without assumption, something that had not been present at the beginning of the night. And through it all, Clara Whitman remained quietly present, not at the center, not hidden, but simply there, existing without the need to prove anything further. As the hours passed and the gala moved toward its close, guests began to leave in smaller groups, their conversations softer, their perspectives subtly changed. Some glanced back toward the stage one last time, while others looked toward the staff, offering nods that carried more meaning than before. And in those small gestures, the impact of the night became clear. It was not just about one performance, it was about a shift in awareness, a reminder that had settled deeply into everyone who had witnessed it. And as Clara finally stepped away from the room, moving down a quiet hallway where the sounds of the event faded behind her, the noise replaced by a calm stillness, she did not look back. She did not wait for recognition or acknowledgement, because she understood something they were only beginning to realize: that true value does not depend on being seen. It simply exists, waiting for the moment when someone finally chooses to notice it. The hallway was quiet in a way the ballroom had never been, the polished noise of conversation and applause now replaced by the soft hum of distant air vents and the faint echo of footsteps against marble. Clara Whitman walked at an unhurried pace, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged, as if the evening behind her had been no more than a passing moment rather than something that had reshaped an entire room. She reached the service exit and paused briefly, her fingers resting on the handle, not out of hesitation, but awareness, as if she understood that beyond that door the world would return to its usual rhythm. People would continue making judgments, drawing conclusions, deciding who belonged and who did not. And yet something had shifted, not just for them, but for her as well. Behind her, the ballroom continued to glow with light and sound, though quieter, now more reflective than before. Inside, conversations lingered longer, eyes met more often, and assumptions no longer arrived as quickly as they once had. The host remained near the stage long after the program had ended, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the empty space where Clara had stood earlier. He replayed the moment again, not the performance itself, but the instant before it when he had made a choice without thinking, and in that reflection, he understood something that could not be undone, not the mistake, but the mindset that allowed it to happen. The organizer spoke with guests as they prepared to leave, his tone measured, his words thoughtful, as he responded to the same question that had echoed throughout the evening: who is she? And each time he answered with the same quiet honesty: someone we should have seen sooner. Outside the building, the night air was cool, carrying the distant sounds of the city. As Clara stepped onto the sidewalk, she did not look back at the entrance. She did not check for recognition or applause. She simply adjusted her coat slightly and began to walk. The streetlights cast long reflections across the pavement, and for a moment, she blended into them, just another figure moving through the city, unnoticed again. And perhaps that was exactly where she was most at ease. A black car slowed briefly near the curb, its driver glancing in her direction, as if considering something, before continuing on. A couple walked past her mid-conversation, their voices fading as they moved down the block, unaware of who had just passed them. And Clara continued forward, her steps steady, her pace unchanged, as if the world did not need to acknowledge her for her to exist fully. And somewhere above the city skyline, the lights from the ballroom still shone faintly through the glass, a distant reminder of a moment that would stay with those who witnessed it far longer than she ever would. Inside that room, something had been corrected, not by force, not by confrontation, but by truth, revealed in its simplest form. And as Clara Whitman disappeared into the rhythm of the night, the lesson she left behind did not fade with her absence. It remained